Hey, this is Mayor Raz J. Baraka, and I just want to first thank the Newark Museum of Art and Director Linda Harrison for putting together a panel of this magnitude and for the incredible work that they're doing here in the city of Newark during these very difficult times. I want to thank all the panelists for coming and all of the folks that will be viewing and engaging in this. This is very, very, very important, and it's hopeful for me to see a city like Newark and cities similar to Newark having the kind of conversations that are necessary to uplift, protect, develop, and put forward a kind of agenda and policy around equity, around equality, around justice, the moral pandemic, something that we've been dealing with in this country for centuries even, since we were brought here against our will. I mean, I represent the only people that were brought here as property to discuss that moral pandemic and all the other things that emanate from that, that make our institutions unequal, that make life in these communities that much more difficult. The ability to pull the covers off of those things, look it straight in the eye, and create opportunities for dialogue and, most importantly, solutions, and to transform systems and society. And I know we want individuals in these communities to begin engaged, to be a part of to be a part of organizations, to exhibit leadership in their families, in their neighborhoods, in their institutions, to help us transform society. But first, we have to deal with the inequity, or I should say simultaneously, we have to deal with the inequity that allows them or enables them to become leaders and do the things in their community. They can't do that with a healthcare system that treats them differently than it treats other people, that gives them less access than it gives other people, as was witnessed in this pandemic. It's difficult to do that with poor and dilapidated housing. It's difficult to do that when it's difficult to find a job that pays a living wage, a salary to take care of yourself and your family. If you're relegated to figuring out where you're going to live, what you're going to eat, how you're going to take care of yourself and your family, it's difficult to think about higher values and issues to transform society. In fact, I don't know if you have the time to engage in discussions at the library, at the museum, or at Rutgers University if you're working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet in your household. So these are very, very, very important discussions. And so as we do the work in Newark to make sure that Newark residents are working at the anchor institutions here, or that we're creating transportation that connects people to jobs at the port, or if we're expanding the port to make sure that they create more jobs and begin to focus them on Newark residents. If we begin to tackle the environmental issues in our community to make people less sick and more healthy by creating cleaner air and a footprint that is talking about more pervious surfaces, more grass, more trees to clean our environment in our community, to be a more resilient community. If we are trying to create development and opportunity and better housing, if we put money aside, as we're doing now, to create housing at 30% of the AMI, so that families who make $32,000 or less as income can have an opportunity to have a place to live and feed their families at the same time. If we're doing universal basic income to give families a little bit more money in their household, cash in their household, to take care of themselves, to take care of the needs that they have to deal with every single day, we are in essence trying to fight for a more equitable community, a healthier community, a safer community here, to give people the opportunity to go and transform society so that these programs that we are doing become unnecessary. Because the programs are only necessary because the community and the society is uneven and the inequity is pervasive in everybody's lives. And so as we put these raft programs together to keep people afloat long enough, prayerfully folks like the people that are being convened today have the right conversations and talk about how to create a society that's equitable, a more perfect union, and give people the opportunity to compete, to succeed, to exist, to grow, to develop, to thrive in a society, in a country that truly believes the words that they wrote on the paper, that all people are created equal. And if we can do that in our minds, create a society where programs like this are no longer necessary, then we've done a great deal. I want to thank again Linda Harrison and the folks over there at the museum for the great job that you're doing. Thank everybody for being engaged in this. Shout out to my Senator Cory Booker, who's also involved in here. Thank everybody. Prayerfully, this discussion is long and it's deep, and we figure out a way to right size the wrongs that has been put on us for centuries. God bless.
Good evening, and welcome to our second session of the Moral Pandemic Summit. Thank you all for being here for a panel on the urban environment and its impact on Black and Brown communities. I am Natasha Barwa, the Manager for Inclusion Initiatives at the Newark Museum of Art, and I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing you to your moderator for the evening, Ifeoma Ebo, the Founding Director of Creative Urban Alchemy, an urban design and strategy practice. She's also an adjunct professor at Syracuse and Columbia University. Ifeoma is an experienced urban designer, architect, and planning strategist with a proven track record of transforming urban spaces into platforms for equity and design excellence. We are grateful that she has accepted our invitation to be the moderator for this panel. I'd also like to thank Bristol Myers Squibb and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their generous support in making this panel happen. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Ifeoma.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you to the Newark Museum of Art for inviting me to be a part of this really timely and important discussion on the urban environment and its impact on Black and Brown communities. Once again, my name is Ifeoma Ebo, and I am zooming in from the unceded lands of the Lenape people, also known as Brooklyn, New York. And I would love to welcome my panelists, Aaron Barnes, Obama Fellow, co-founder and CEO of IOB in our backyards, Brian C. Lee, Jr., design principal of Co-Locate, and Michael Neal, senior research associate at the Urban Institute. Welcome. So I would love to start this conversation to really start by learning more about the organizations that you're representing here today. And so if you can start by please telling us about your organization, focusing on the key issues that your organization addresses as it relates to the impact of urban environments on Black and Brown communities. And I want to start with you, Brian Lee.
Well, thank you, Ife. It's a pleasure to be here with this esteemed panel, and I will start by just kind of framing what we do broadly, and then I'll tell you what we do as Co-Locate. So we work in the practice of design justice, and it really starts to call for us to think about how we envision spaces of racial, social, and cultural justice through the process and outcomes of design. What does it look like for us to envision spaces of reparation, of healing, of transformation that are directly associated with the cultural forms that exist within place? How do we use design as a means to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression? And so Co-Locate seeks to harness that particular idea and acknowledges that for nearly every injustice in the world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that helps to sustain it. And so thinking through what we do as a practice, we do full-scale architectural design all the way down to kind of the more ephemeral, artistic, expressive forms of work. And really the intention is to make sure that we are seeking liberation through that work. So just quickly, that means that we are trying to acknowledge narratives and histories of past oppression in place, that we are seeking mutual aid through our work, that we are seeking to deconstruct systems of supremacy and to future set. How do we envision, again, those futures that we want to live in? So that's in brief what we do, and I appreciate the moment to kind of share a little bit of that.
Powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'd love to shift to Aaron Barnes. Please tell us a bit about IOB.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me. IOB stands for In Our Backyards, and the idea is basically that we work with residents in communities who have great ideas for their neighborhoods and help them plan, fund, and make those ideas come to life. And what I've learned about IOB over the last 14 years is that people typically are going to seek the simplest and easiest path to getting work done. And so if anybody is turning to an online crowdfunding platform as a way of raising funds for their work, it's likely that they haven't been able to receive funds in some other way. And so one of the things that I've had the ability to observe over time is that a lot of the people who use IOB have been rejected from other types of grant applications, from local philanthropies or from government. And what we see is sort of a reflection of what's in the data, which is that less than 10% of philanthropic funding is funding BIPOC-led organizations and initiatives in cities. And so a lot of IOB's work is just resident-led, focused on neighborhoods. Some of it is very simple, but I think that what we're seeing below the surface is just another way of looking at all of these levels of systemic racism in our philanthropic and governmental systems.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And last but not least, Michael, please tell us about the Urban Institute.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name again is Michael Neal, and again, a senior researcher here at the Urban Institute. And, from the beginning, the Urban Institute was originally actually founded by President Lyndon Johnson back in 1968, in large part to address the challenges that were being experienced by American cities and its inhabitants. So even from its start, I think that there has always been a focus on communities, urban communities, and the people that inhabit them, oftentimes people of color. More specifically, I sit in what's known as the Housing Finance Policy Center, where we think a lot about homeownership. Obviously, by its name, we think a lot about the connection between homeownership and the financial system, mortgage markets, to be exact. But we also think about the equity, the inequities, and the disparities with respect to homeownership as well. And so, we have thought a lot about both the challenges that households of color have with respect to achieving homeownership. Those are the homeownership rate gaps. But we've also thought a lot about disparities or differences in the benefits of homeownership, whether that's housing equity, whether that's home valuation, whether that's what we call the user cost of homeownership, or any non-financial costs. And so the combination of them is really pointing to, the challenge of ensuring that people of color can not only achieve homeownership, but also benefit from it, maintain it, and benefit from it. And then the final thing that I'll say is that, my colleagues at Urban, do research across in racial equity across a number of dimensions. Colleagues are working on disparities in the rental market. Research colleagues are working on disparities with respect to homelessness, outside of housing, disparities with respect to health policy, labor markets, tax policy. And so we have, I think there are a number of researchers, of which I'm only one, who have, I think, helped the Urban Institute and helped the country, I think, to really better understand both the challenges in this area as well as the potential solutions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to stay with you, Michael. You bring up some really great points that the Urban Institute focuses on. And, historically, actions such as redlining, exclusionary zoning have been used as racist land development practices. In your work, how are you seeing the legacy of this practice in housing policy and economic development? How are you seeing it addressed innovatively?
Yeah, no, that's that's a great question. And look, let me start off, if you don't mind. Let me go off script just a little bit here and just, make what I think is an important point. And that is, we in the homeownership space, we often talk about, we often start with redlining, with Hulk maps, and those are certainly important. And research shows that disparities across those lines. But we know that this country was based on racial discrimination. And I will go even further to say that this country has historically, from its beginning, integrated ownership of property with ownership in the country. We know that in order for you to vote in this country, you had to be a property owner, and that restricted both across racial lines as well as across gender lines. And so I think, it's always important to keep that in mind, that, this country was built on racial and gender discrimination in a way that kept certain people from not just owning property, but also having ownership in the country. And so kind of to piggyback off of that, where we often kind of start at is certainly around areas, around issues of redlining, whereby lending and capital flow was denied to neighborhoods deemed risky, which largely coincided with the majority race and ethnicity of those neighborhoods. And I think what we've seen is a compounding of those effects, not just the effect of the deficit through time, but also the effect of the people that it helped. That is, the government also at the same time was helping white households. And those white households were able to build generational wealth that contributes to the disparities in homeownership and wealth that we see today. And so the question is, what is it that we need to do? And I think first, the place that we have to start is by understanding that if this is a long-term, persistent challenge, it's not going to take 1 year to solve the problem. It's going to take deep commitment from all of us over a long period of time to actually close these gaps. That's number one. Number two, specifically with respect to redlining, we know that the Fair Housing Act made it effectively illegal. And yet we still see in the data disparities or gaps in homeownership rates between white homeowners and homeowners of color. And the second thing with respect to exclusionary zoning is that we still observe that people of color are often steered to neighborhoods that are of lower value. Neighborhoods of color are often placed near industrial sites, which weigh on the value of these homes. Again, getting back and appraisal bias. That is, that homes in majority Black and majority Hispanic neighborhoods are often undervalued relative to what their true value ought to be. And so that gets back, I think, to the original point of the challenge is not just how do we ensure that homeowners achieve homeownership, but also how do we ensure that when they do, that they actually benefit from it to the same degree. And so what are some of those policy solutions? One of them that we've seen are ways in which we can encourage minority depository institutions and other community development financial institutions to grow and expand the amount of capital that they invest into neighborhoods of color. Why do we do this? Why do we think that this is a good idea? One reason is because we have seen in our research on Black banks that in fact, Black banks actually increased their mortgage lending to Black home buyers in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And if we think back, this was a time in which many financial institutions were fleeing the housing market more generally, but were fleeing Black buyers in part because they were dissatisfied with FHA. And so Black banks filled the gap to a degree by expanding their lending in a time in which many others deemed it a risky endeavor. But that being said, Black banks are very small. There are fewer than 30 Black banks, and their capital bases are quite tiny compared to their majority white owned financial institutions. And so that's where we try to connect, where we kind of to achieve scale. We try to connect it to CDFIs, both of whom are mission oriented in a way that ensures that we could get some scale with respect to mortgage lending, but also to capital flow more generally. So I want to stop there and say two things. A, the degree to which we're doing mortgage lending, we're about boosting home ownership. The degree to which we're talking about capital flows, we're talking about really boosting the economic activity within a jurisdiction or within a city. And then a second part with respect to exclusionary zoning. One of the things that I think one key policy, and we've seen a number of locales around the country beginning to do this on the zoning front, and that is to begin to allow for higher density construction within the limits. The higher density construction, hopefully, the hoped for outcome is in part to provide more affordable housing options within areas that are oftentimes close to people's jobs. That was something that Mayor Baraka talked about, this connection between where you live and where you work, and oftentimes having to combine your housing costs with your transportation costs to get some sense of the overall cost of living. But at the same time, it having a racial equity lens. That is the degree to which the lack of these types of products oftentimes has the effect of keeping people of color from being able to live in these neighborhoods and ultimately to benefit from them. And so I think it gets back to, let me just come back to the broader point, and that is, while these solutions are certainly ones that we have talked about and we have seen policymakers take steps on, again, it has to be a full commitment. It cannot be a situation where in 1 year or one administration, we are committed to doing this. In another year, another administration, we pull back. That kind of lack of uniformity with respect to the intensity of the effort doesn't necessarily help us to solve the issue either.
Thank you so much for just providing that really great foundation of just, setting the framework for what the problem is, what the challenge is, and really providing really great insight as to what are things that financial institutions or even government can do to really address these challenges. And so I'd love to shift to Erin, and just to learn from you, you speak about, the fact that your organization supports grassroots efforts and the work that community is doing, really community-driven initiatives. So what kind of specific grassroots efforts that you are seeing bubbling to the surface that your organization has funded?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation and pairing the different levels of innovation, because I think so rarely do I get to see the way that community-led efforts and government-led efforts interplay with each other. I think there's a few different ways I want to talk about community-led work. The first thing I guess that I want to say is that it's given me a chance to get to know a lot of cities really closely. IOB has place-based focuses in New York, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Memphis, and Pittsburgh. And I think in an example of a city like Cleveland, you can see lots of different types of community-led efforts depending on what that neighborhood is. It can be everything from raising money to give bicycles to the new refugee community, to bring a neighborhood together to paint a mural. That's and the result of an effort of two neighborhoods talking about the way that highway construction divided the two of them. And the ways that one neighborhood has benefited and become more affluent over time, and the other has had the opposite effect, and them painting the story of that history on a mural together. I think that there's just a bunch of different ways that people see their neighborhoods, and I think it's an interesting way of giving people the opportunity to tell the stories of their community's histories through these place-based efforts. The other thing that I find really interesting, kind of looking at IOB projects holistically, is that the same type of project can show up really differently in different places. So one example of this is that we have a lot of projects that are focused on, how you could make your street safer. And the definition of safety for people is really, really different. So some people that means, wider sidewalks and protected bike lanes. For other people, that means making sure that intersections have longer periods of time for people to walk more slowly across a crosswalk. For other people, that means better lighting. In some communities, that means reducing the number of wild dogs. In other places, it actually means changing lighting so that you can see the natural night sky better. And so I think what defines something like a safe street, which could seem really obvious to you, just thinking about it as a concept, when you see it in lots of different places, it shows up really differently. And I think one of the most interesting things that I've been able to witness at IOB over the last 14 years is that types of projects have evolved from being really like fringy and new and like seemingly impossible to becoming mainstreamed over time. And I think this is where I see the intersection with like top-down work and government-led work to be really interesting. So, I remember seeing like the beginnings of community composting efforts that were then later adopted by the Department of Sanitation in New York. I remember also like we have supported tons and tons of projects that are focused on funding Black doulas for Black moms in cities where in communities of color, there's much higher infant mortality rates. And then to see those types of data picked up and like talked about on like regular news channels on a regular basis and seeing it on John Oliver, you can kind of see how community-led efforts have put a spotlight on really local issues and then see how they're systemic across many places. IOB's been able to support some of the first protected bike lanes, and now that's like a very normal part of cities that you see. I remember a few years ago, we were able to support the bail money for protesters who were arrested outside of the Confederate statues that were then removed in Memphis, Tennessee. Now that type of activity is really much more commonplace. And so I love seeing the way that like community-led efforts can kind of like break through the ice and move things more mainstream. And we were able to see that in the last 20 months too, in the pandemic and all of the interrelated issues and crises that came up in the last 20 months, whether those were like very large scale efforts of mutual aid, being able to provide food to neighbors that needed it, PPE and other types of like ways of meeting immediate needs, or if it was very small scale efforts about, making sure that like older folks who were living alone and socially isolated had ways of connecting with people, whether it's like through games or social connection, like letters and things like that. Same thing with kids who were feeling more distressed and distant. So I think like it's been nice to be able to see the ways that those things scale up and down and can be like iterated in different places.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight. And what I'm also hearing in what you're saying is that there's also this importance of partnerships between sectors, whether it's community coming up with the ideas that are really relevant to place and are really born out of the lived experience, centering the lived experience, but then also government bringing to the table the resources and support necessary to make those projects happen, particularly in the spaces that are governed by city government. And so I would love to, shift now to Brian, where your work, I believe, sits somewhere in the intersection there. And you often talk about design justice and the relationship between power and care in your work as a practitioner on the ground doing this work with communities. So I'd love for you to share, just talk a bit about that relationship, and also how do you use these values effectively towards creating new strategies for communities of color?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think part of this, to Aaron's point, actually, when I was at the Arts Council, we received an IOB grant, maybe 2014 or 15, to work with some of our youth solutions students. So to that point, it always is about how we build precedent and how we model what is possible, how we future set, as I mentioned a little earlier. So through co-locate, as you talked about, design justice calls on us to kind of reconsider those relationships, as you stated, about power, values, and care. But we define power through the lens, specifically through the lens of land. When we talk about Malcolm X's quote, where he talks about the fact that all revolutions are based on blood and land, it is the landless versus the landlord. It is the power differential between those who own land and those who do not, that shapes so much of our society. Malcolm was talking about blood for real, but I take that as to mean metaphorically, as well as sacrifice, right? So it is about like, who is willing to sacrifice or be sacrificed in that battle to understand that power dynamic. And in doing so, we understand that those who do control land or are fighting to control land or their own space in the world instill their sets of values in that land, right? And so values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. And then ultimately, we know that, we talk about what's the Cornel West quote where he talks about the fact that justice is what love looks like in public. And our quote is really, design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. And it really is fundamentally about how we connect to community beyond the kind of incremental or colloquial, but how do we actually start to set precedent in the many ways that we can. And so when I pull back, I think about the establishment of our work at Co-Locate and how we framed the kind of starting point, which was essentially a radical design justice practice that was to some extent doomed to fail because we wanted to be too radical for it to exist to some extent. And in doing so, set as many precedents along the way before we were ceremoniously exited from the profession. That hasn't happened, and so we've continued to build and grow stronger and to create more of that. But to a couple of those points, our work centers three core actions, which is how do we organize, how do we advocate, and how do we actively use those two things to bring about design, right? So every single project that we work on starts to frame itself through the organizing efforts that are presently happening, right? Honor the griot in the sense that there are already people who have a voice on the ground. And if we are able to amplify that voice, we're more readily able to bring about the terms of justice that we are proposing, for instance. And so I look at projects like the Claiborne Innovation District in New Orleans, which again saw a highway cut through it in the late 60s, like many other cities across the country. And the core of activism that started almost immediately after that. And it took 50 years for people to listen to those voices, right? It took so long. And what would it have meant if we were able to consolidate and actually acknowledge those voices in our policies and our procedures much earlier on? Does it take us the sacrifice of producing on our own, using our own money, creating our own elements just to be visible, to be present? And that often is what is forced upon us. So, I see such a connection in that these small moments, whether it's the Claiborne Highway, where we're trying to build a marketplace that straps together a neighborhood that lost 400 businesses, that lost oak trees and a sense of community, health, wealth, safety, and lost its sense of or continued to be stripped away of its culture over time, right? So much so that even now it's such a tremendous fight to maintain that. Or to the sense of paper monuments, which is a project we just recently completed a few years back, which started to ask the question, can we see what new monuments to the city of New Orleans actually means? What do the people today want to see in present? Can we acknowledge that maybe erecting 20-foot tall white men on horses is not the way to go for every symbol of our community, right? Maybe it's not. And so in doing that, in actually projecting a design into the world, we are attempting to set precedent both in the design side of things, the pedagogy, the policy, the procedures, the practice, the projects, and the people, recognizing that the signals that are sent out to impact us on a daily basis, those signals, those signifiers are what we learn, the pedagogy that shapes our ideology that shapes our policies, those policies that shape how we implement our procedures, are all the things that are telling us what we need to do on a daily basis. And from a practice side of things, from a people side of things, from a project side of things, we can say, yes, we accept those rules and regulations, and we will survive in the face of those. or we can fundamentally shift the dynamic, that power dynamic between them, reestablish a set of values that send a signal back to policymakers, procedure makers, and pedagogical kind of the kind of pedagogical frameworks that say this is not how we want to operate. We want to exist beyond the kind of heteropatriarchal capitalist frameworks that we have established in this country. So that is the basis of the practice, and I do see somewhat of a link between what Aaron has mentioned and what Michael has mentioned as well. So.
Thank you. So I want to stay with you, and you bring up a number of interesting topics in what you just mentioned, and tomorrow's discussion, as a part of this 3-day sessions, will center white supremacy and white privilege. But I want to bring this into our conversation regarding the impact of the urban environment on communities of color, positively or negatively. How do you see white people and white-led organizations showing up in this work that strives to address these challenges? What needs to change or stay the same?
That's directed at me, yeah? I'm
starting with you, Brian, and then I'd love to hear from Michael and then hear from her.
Sorry, there's a thunderstorm happening here, so bear with me, apologies. Yeah, so I do think that there is a framework of understanding around whiteness that actually has to undergird all of our conversations around that power dynamic. And so when I think about whiteness and its immediate framing as Blackness as its core opposition means that power floats to a particular condition, which is that whiteness. And so if you understand what that means when white people claim and occupy space within communities of color, it means that there is a absorption or displacement of kind of cultural considerations on the ground, because whiteness often does not recognize or reconcile culture on the ground. It often ignores the small tendencies, patterns, and routines that actually mean a significant amount in that place. And I say that just to acknowledge, first of all, there's something that is always conflated when we talk about these differences in racial considerations, whether that is the difference between color, race, ethnicity, nationality, and culture. And they all have different meanings and we all use them interchangeably. And it's certainly necessary to acknowledge what we frame through the lens of culture, which is the fact that culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. And if you understand the fact that that long history of marginalized communities having to shift and shape how they pattern themselves in society means that it's almost impossible for white-led organizations that have no cultural framing, that have no cultural kind of undergirding to come in and have a rational response to that place. It's just hard to do because it's not surface level. It's not about Blackness as a race, Blackness as a color. It's about Blackness as a culture, or it's about other ethnicities as a culture. It's the lived patterns, routines, and habits. And if you do not live those patterns, habits, and routines, it is again hard to manage that relationship.
Thank you so much for that insight. And Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts to chime in on this point.
Yeah, no, I think this is key, and I'll speak to this, more as a researcher, and less kind of as a practitioner. But even in research, even when we as researchers tried to be objective and think that we're being objective, there are still ways in which I think white supremacy is informed in our work. And I'll walk through four concrete ways to move away from the more abstract understanding. And the first one is when we talk about deficits. We talk about home ownership rates. We talk about households of color are less likely to own homes. Households of color, when they own homes, they own lower value homes. That we often frame the minority and the Black experience in particular as a deficit. Which is problematic because it ignores a lot of the positive steps that have been taken by the Black community to uplift themselves. I mean, I know that Black banks as one of those things, and we know specifically with respect to, say, the Tulsa massacre, that was an attempt to effectively eliminate Black progress, or the other side of the coin, to reinstate Black deficit. So that's number one. But with that, the implication with deficits is that somehow the white experience, the typical outcome across the white community is itself the target. So, let's go back to home ownership rates again. Nationwide, Black households, 48% of Black households own their own home. 72% of white households own their own home. Gosh, we should do something about that. We need to boost home ownership for Black households. What's the target? The target is 72%. The target is the white experience. And so we see that being pervasive across a number of research disciplines, where when we talk about closing gaps, effectively what we're saying is that the Black experience needs to somehow mirror the white experience. And that in of itself makes heroic assumptions about the preferences and the interests of Black America. But then, kind of what's implied by that is that somehow, if we are going to somehow close these gaps such that the Black experience or the minority experience is in line with the white experience, hey, home ownership rates are the same. That might be one way in which it shows up. It implicitly, it means that the relationships that minorities and that Black people in particular have with certain economic outcomes themselves match that of white America. So how does that play out? So, let's say I'm sitting in my office and, I've got, a bunch of data and I want to know, what are the key reasons why white people own homes? And, maybe that has to do with, marital status. Maybe it has to do with educational attainment. It has to do with income. Maybe it has to do with wealth. And so, maybe those are my four, key determinants of home ownership. And as you can see, oh, wow, Black households are somehow, they have deficits in all of these areas, and that's why they don't own homes. But the other part of that is, okay, we have what we've built is some relationship. What we're doing is we're quantifying some relationship between each of these four variables and home ownership itself. And then we come back and say, see, this is the relationship for the U.S. overall, and now we need to help people of color to somehow achieve. We assume that relationship holds for people of color as well, where it might not be the case. So white people may not have as strong of a relationship. The relationship among white people may not be as strong between home ownership and income, in part because they can always fall back on wealth. And so a policy outcome might be, look, we're not quite as reliant on income as an informant to home ownership, because the results show me that this relationship is not as strong because there are all these other variables going on. But at the same time, we know that people of color and Black people in particular do not have wealth, and they do not have as much wealth. And so that relationship between income and home ownership is likely to be much stronger. And so what winds up happening is you wind up putting less of an effect on the key relationships that matter for minorities and for people of color in the outcomes that you want them to achieve. And then the fourth thing, after deficits and anchoring and relationships, the fourth thing is around public policy. And I kind of alluded to this, and institutions. And, I do want to step back and say, through some work that we've done specifically on Newark, this was work funded, in fact, by the Prudential Foundation. So thank you to them for their generosity here. What we were able to find is that Newark, particularly in the city of Newark, that the likelihood of them losing their home in the aftermath as these public policies around foreclosure moratoriums and forbearance and those kind of terms, as those begin to unwind, those households, those homeowners, particularly in the city of Newark, are more at risk of foreclosure. And so one kind of federal policy, and this I think gets back to a lot of what Aaron was talking about in terms of policies that can be done to help to improve outcomes. One federal policy has been for the Treasury Department to work with states to give them financial assistance so that the states can turn around and disperse that money to homeowners at risk around their states, of which one area of risk in the state of New Jersey is the city of Newark. And the reason why this is important is because this is one of the key policies that explicitly says that you need to target socially disadvantaged individuals, including those that have historically been marginalized with respect to homeownership. Very much a shift in terms of how we think about crafting policy. Policy is now at the center of this policy, or as close to the center as possible of this policy, is race and ethnicity. And so I think this is a new way of thinking about, hey, how do we move away from the kinds of the way in which white supremacy can undermine policy meant to hurt people. In one explicit way is to say, look, this is meant to target people who historically have not done well in this particular environment.
Thank you so much, Brian and Michael. You bring up some really great points. I mean, definitely, Brian, this point about having a deep cultural understanding of place really supports the work of building trust in community. And then Michael, when you talk about this, deficit-oriented approach, I've also seen that in my work where, when working in a community of color, Black community in particular, there's always like, what's the gap? What's missing? What do we need to fill there? As opposed to what is the richness that's already there, that can be built on, that can be supported. And so speaking about support, I'd love to shift to Aaron, the one white person on this panel, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is your contribution to this conversation, and how are you seeing other white-led organizations addressing this challenge, and what do you feel needs to change or stay the same?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd be happy to speak from my perspective as a white person working in this field. I think that there's a lot of really well-intentioned white people working in the field of the urban environment, and I'm certainly one of them. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we're failing this work. And I think at a fundamental level, white people have, and I'm really speaking from my own perspective here, an obsession with sort of this performative performance to show that we're good people, especially as there's growing evidence that we have a complicit role in all the harm that's being done to Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color. And I think that that's creating this sort of dislodging of a person's psyche of who they believe they are and who they see their impacts as being. It's creating a lot of very weird performance. And so I think one way that this shows up, I mentioned before around funding. I think that there's lots of ways that there's exclusion in philanthropic funding, in the way that decisions are made, the way that things are made inclusive and accessible. And I think that's been talked about in a lot of spaces, and there's experts in this area that are better than me to speak about it. The second thing that I see is a lot of tokenizing of communities of color in this work. I think white people oftentimes are centering themselves in the way that they look and appear, and feel some kind of pressure to sort of deliver a way that they want to have communities of color show up with their work. And they'll approach that work in a really transactional way, looking at short-term results without investing in any of the long-term relationship building. I think that can do a lot of harm. And I feel like the thing that is really so obvious is that it's also doing this huge disservice to white people in never ever learning. So I think tokenizing, a lack of building long-term relationships, a real lack of reciprocity is one that I see as well. A focus on transactional relationships. And then I guess a fundamental problem that most people have in doing the work is just in listening. And I think that that just seems to be like a much bigger problem when you're constantly focused on centering yourself and your own experience in the work. I think the one thing that I see over and over and over again is white people constantly preferencing decisions based on their own lived experience, but totally disregarding the lived experience of Black and Indigenous and people of color in almost in the exact same conversation or just seconds apart. And I know I've been guilty of doing these things as well. But I think like an effort to invest long-term, build trust, build real relationships, and to listen more, I think could take things in a much better direction.
Thank you so much for that insight. And I want to stay with you, Erin, because I want to, I want to ask all of you for words of encouragement. Where do you see this work going? This work towards addressing equity and justice in communities of color. What source of hope can you provide for the audience that's watching? Perhaps there's practitioners in the audience. There are people who are actually on the ground doing this work or are interested in doing this work. What form of encouragement can you provide them and insight from what you've gained in your experience thus far?
Thanks. I guess I'll just say that, I think the work of IOB and what I'm most interested in is people really showing up and investing in civic lives and the lives outside of their own personal life, where the edge of where your home hits your sidewalk. And, I think it was a horrible experience getting there, but I think that there was a lot of things that happened in the last 20 months that broke people to a point where a lot of the work of communities was really just sort of rational. And I think that the level to which the pandemic and so many other interrelated crises broke people, it got people to react in a more emotional way. And I actually think that that's a huge benefit for people to show up in their full emotional selves and put their values out first, instead of trying to rationalize their way through some sort of community process. So I actually see a lot of hope in that. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I felt very proud of my country when I saw people taking to the streets, and when I see organizations that are talking about equity and justice in ways that they weren't before. So totally, I agree with you. And so, Michael, I'd love to hear from you. What form of encouragement can you provide to the audience that you're seeing this work?
Yeah, again, I'm going to speak again as a researcher, and so forgive me here, but number one, I think is data. I mean, we have gotten much more data. The software that we use to analyze that data, we're seeing a bit of a growing diversity, not as much as we like, a bit of growing diversity in terms of the people who are analyzing them and the backgrounds that they're coming from, which has created, I think, a richness in terms of understanding the true challenges that people of color are experiencing. The second thing I think that offers hope is kind of piggybacking on what Erin said is, when we think about some of the actions taken by this administration, and I'm certainly not saying that all of them have been perfect or that they're all right or that they're all going to work, or that they're all to the scale that they should be. But I will say that when you look at things like the homeowner assistance fund, and you look at kind of ways in which we've targeted appraisal bias and other areas in which the federal government, I think, has been explicit in centering racial equity as part of its work, I think that there's hope for continued progress. And then the final thing I'll say is, there is evidence that I think the analytical community generally believes that over the longer term, that the nation will continue to diversify. And to a degree, we certainly don't want that diversification to be because certain groups of people are more likely to pass away than others. But the degree to which we do observe a greater level of diversity, I think that it's going to force many of the institutions, many of the power structures that Brian was talking about, to really come to grips with the inherent racist policies that are embedded in them, frankly, from a business perspective, in order to continue doing business, but hopefully from a policy perspective, that the social contract that we all aspire to is actually comes to pass.
Thank you so much, Michael, for providing that insight from the research-based perspective. And I also add that listening to the community and the community voice is also a data point, and that needs to be considered when developing new policy as well. So thank you for that rich insight. And so, Brian, I'd love to hear from you as well. Where do you see places for hope? What kind of encouragement can you provide to those watching?
I actually see a ton of hope in this work. I mean, I think we always talk about design as protest. To protest is to have an unyielding sense of hope in this work. It requires us to have a collective hope to move these things forward. So where I see it, I see changes in pedagogy across universities that are starting to accommodate cohorts of design justice students and to create programs around design justice and spatial justice where that did not exist 10, 55 years ago, a year ago. And so that rapidly crossing the nation. I see policies and procedures. So policies in, especially in the Northwest, where they are including procurement processes that are steeped in critical race theory and design justice that require community design advocates within the procurement process. It fundamentally changes the outputs of design. There was $500,000 worth of projects that were based in critical race theory and design justice a few years ago. There are nearly $2 billion worth of work in the Northwest right now that are centered on those as principal arguments. So I see it there. I see it in practice and practices across the country that are shifting and being more honest about the work that they want to do. And I obviously see it in the individuals who are pressing it here today. All of you, I'm just so proud that I get a chance to be on a panel like this with folks who are pushing this type of work on a daily basis. So yeah, there's hope to be found in all of our work and all of the places that we see community and see these things manifest.
Absolutely, I agree with you as well. It certainly must start where we're educating the practitioners who are actually building the new visions for our cities and communities. And I'm proud to be an academic myself, teaching students in the realm of design justice and spatial justice. So once again, thank you so much, Erin, Michael, Brian, for your insight, for your wisdom, for sharing your experience authentically, meaningfully. Thank you to the Newark Museum of Art for the opportunity, for bringing us all together for this very timely and wonderful discussion. And thank you to you, the audience, for joining us. We hope that what we've shared with you changes your frame of thinking and changes the way you operate. Thank you and good night.